Good evening, Andover. Good evening, seniors in the audience. And how was the barbecue? Are you all hot? It's a little sweaty, a little red. That's good. Summer is here. And hello. Oh my gosh, we've got alumni in the audience. What? Let them sneak in. Well, this is a bittersweet moment for me, I have to say. How could I have imagined back in fall that we would actually make it here tonight? Our final CAMD scholar presenting tonight. It's a kind of a culmination, a crescendo, a capstone. Can we think of other words, synonyms for finale? Oh, nice. I like that one. A climax. It's not an ending. It is really a new beginning, right? Because so many scholars behind you that will be inspired by the work that you've seen your peers do. And I really appreciate all your support for these young researchers, writers, scholars, and also hopefully being inspired by them to pursue your own passions. This year's CAMD Scholars Program has taken us on a journey around the world, right? We started in Latin America. We touched on Africa to Asia and the Caribbean. We traveled through the ages in vast swaths of historical time, exploring medical racism, racialized psychiatry, literature, dance, carnival, and K-pop. We've learned about interdisciplinary techniques and concepts, anthropology, sociology, history, literary criticism, post-colonial theory. Yeah, all of that, and more to come. Our scholars have taught us new vocabulary, things like magical realism, and syncretism, and triple consciousness, and third space theory, and ethnopsychiatry. Amazing. So to our scholars who have worked so hard all year long to bring us these amazing presentations, I thank you. To the faculty who supported them, and to your peers who've been incredible audiences, and so receptive and inquisitive. Thank you all. Looking forward to next year's cohort, I know. And we will be able to think about next year soon. But for tonight, the focus is on our final scholar, Frank Zhou, who brings it all home, in a sense. Frank spent hours and hours in the archives. You're going to hear a little bit more about that, digging into the school's history. And he's going to regale us with Andover stories, but in a way that will show how Andover is connected to the larger world, and that how Andover fits into the larger fabric of global history. I think you're going to find this an exciting and illuminating story about your own school history in a way that you probably haven't thought about it before. To get us started, I'm very, very proud to introduce Dr. Paige Roberts. We are so fortunate here to have a school archivist, a professional scholar in her own right. And she is an incredible teacher and educator and colleague. And thank you, Dr. Roberts, for all you have done for the CAMD Scholars Program and for Frank and for the school.
Frank first came to me in February 2020 as a lower. We talked a little bit about volunteering in the archives. And I think maybe one of the hardest things about the lockdown was I kept thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to see Frank again. I was so bummed. And, I have to say, I probably wouldn't have gotten through summer 2020 without him. We started meeting that summer on Zoom, and our conversations really quickly started focusing on the history of Chinese students at Andover. Something that I've been working on for a while. So really quickly, he started reading a tremendous amount of secondary source literature, primary source documents in the fall and winter 2020, 21, before we decided with M. Martin that maybe he should think about doing a CAMD Scholar project. So this project has been a really important part of my multi-year initiative on Chinese students, which resulted in the website. You see the postcard on your chair, and that site was launched last November. And I'm so grateful to have been able to collaborate with several years of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and external scholars, including, in particular, Adrian Zhang, class of 2018, Dr. Hiju Sun, who was in the history department, and Dr. Nick Zufelt in computer science on our Silences and Gaps class. In addition, MIT Professor Emma Tang has been very, very generous with her time, and Dr. Xiao Li built the website for us, and she was kind enough to meet with me and Frank, God, I think every week last summer. It was really amazing. She's incredible. So clearly, you all know Frank. He's an extraordinary person, and his paper, I think, is extraordinary, partly because of the really compelling, important questions that he asks in a thorough and really nuanced way. And there are many ways in which I think he can be a model for doing school history work, and that's one really important way. And so I'd like to say that his work is unique, and that it rises to the actual, the level of kind of contributing to scholarship in a really substantial way. First of all, exploring the transnational history of educational exchange between the United States and China, and also complicating the history of this particularly influential educational institution, Phillips Academy. So this is part also of this larger Committee on Challenging Histories work. We're going to be having a student panel. Frank is nice enough to participate in that on Monday evening. We're going to be meeting in the Underwood room at 7 o'clock. So we really need your input, your questions, your thoughts, your concerns about school history. So I hope you can come, and if not, then feel free to get in touch with me. We need people to be involved. Whatever year, whatever your topic, we really need people to be involved. So I'm just really honored to have been part of Frank's work on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever seen a crowd this happy on Friday the 13th. Thank you for coming out and listening to me tell this story. It's really incredible. Some of you might know me from environmental advocacy, others maybe from the April 13th research event, others maybe for all too intense games of Mafia on the Great Lawn, or even for quarantining together in Sykes with COVID. So thank you so much. This is an amazing cross-section of people. It's so wonderful to be here tonight. Let me get away from this. I wanted to start with a few notes. One is that precedent tells me to begin with a note of gratitude. And I certainly want to offer that, but I want to leave that till the end because there's an image that I think would be useful and helpful in terms of painting a more meaningful picture of gratitude. The second is that ever since I was a little kid, I've loved words. These are some of the books currently in my dorm room, but ever since I was little, I've loved to hear the voices of the authors that I was reading. I loved to live in their worlds. I wanted to be just like them. I wanted to be a man of letters. And I was sometimes successful, sometimes not. Thank you. My mother used to walk around our apartment with a point and shoot and take pictures of me as I, was up to my shenanigans around the house. I've always tried to be a man of letters, not always successful. I'd like to think that today I'm continuing on that trajectory. After all, this project looked at thousands of letters in the PA archives and special collections. I've brought a smattering of the archival documents with me here today, so if you'd like to take a look at the things that we're dealing with, feel free to come up after the presentation and take a look yourself. Now, there are two things that men of letters or people who like literature love. The first is precedents, whether it be raising them up or tearing them down. And the second is a good story. So today I thought I'd tell two stories of two star baseball pitchers across two generations engaged in two unprecedented moments of historical agency. The first begins with China's #1 research university and the man who helped establish it. I'm talking about Tsinghua University in Peking, China. The man is Liang Cheng, and he was born in 1864. He's about this tall, had large brown eyes, thinning gray hair, and was a star pitcher on his high school's varsity baseball team. He had this wonderful energy and exuberance about him. He was Chinese, but his interactions with the US began quite early. In fact, the first time he was in the US was when he was 12. This was me at 12. Sneak peek. 12-year-old Frank was not ready to hop on a boat in China, get ferried across the Pacific Ocean, hop off in America, hop onto a transcontinental train across the country and down to New England. But that's exactly what Liang did. We might ask, why was Liang in the US in the first place? The answer lies in a series of wars that China fought against a series of Western powers in the 19th century called the Opium Wars. Many of these were waged by sea, some on land. The result, regardless, is that China suffered crushing defeats in the Opium Wars, and it left the Qing dynasty government that was at the helm of China at the time reeling, thinking, just what have we done wrong? Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes when we have new neighbors in the house next door, my mother will give me a plate of cookies or some fruit and ask me to go next door and to warm up with the neighbors to figure out what they're all about. That's exactly what China thought to do to the US. So between 1872 and 1881, China sends cohorts of students, Chinese students, to the US to figure out what US educational institutions are all about and what they're missing out on. Liang spends a couple years in New England and in 1878 finds himself at a school called Phillips Academy. We don't know too much about Liang's time at Andover. It was 1878 after all, but we do know one thing. Liang was the star pitcher on Andover's varsity baseball team. It's now AE Day on 1881, and Liang finds himself a few innings in to the varsity baseball game against Exeter with bases loaded. Liang walks up to bat. The pitch is thrown. Liang swings at the ball. There's a loud crack, and the ball soars through the air. And over in the Exeter crowd erupts a chorus of jeers and racial slurs. The play ended up being a 2-run triple. It was instrumental in helping Andover win AE Day that year. But this was a story that Liang would carry with him for years following his graduation. Interestingly enough, though, Liang, even years following his departure from Andover Hill, would speak most fondly of his time at Andover. He maintained that Andover was the best place to cultivate good students. To dive into why, just how he remained so affectionate for Andover, one question we might ask is, what does it mean to be a good Andover student? Let's just take that at 2022. In 2022, what does it mean to be a good Andover student? Let's take maybe 5 to 6 audience responses. Don't be shy, don't bite. It is Friday the 13th, but all right, Claire?
Non-civvy.
Non-civvy, thank you, Claire. Sahila, is it?
Yeah. Do your homework.
Do your homework, thank you. Love?
Big blue kind.
Big blue kind. Alex?
So,
Thank you, Alex. You're much too generous. See, the transition was going to be Liang was thinking about some of the same things. I don't think Liang was thinking about me. But let's just take it as that. Liang was thinking about some of the same things that we all are thinking about today. Non-civvy, big blue nice, doing your homework. These were some of the things that Liang himself had to do as a Chinese student at Andover, and some things that he thought were useful and generative in allowing youth of subsequent generations to experience as well. So Liang then begins to develop this wish to bring Chinese students to America. and in 1902, he becomes the best Chinaman to do it. In 1902, Liang becomes the Chinese ambassador to the United States. If anyone in the US was going to be in a position to bring Chinese students to the US, it would be Liang. But Liang, as soon as he started out on his efforts, found tremendous difficulties ahead of him. You see, 1902 was the height of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was implemented in 1882, just months after Liang left Andover Hill in 1881. The act banned Chinese laborers from entering the United States. In 1902, the year Liang became ambassador, Congress voted to continue the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1904, 2 years into Liang's tenure as ambassador, Congress voted to extend it indefinitely. Liang entered a US that was anything but receptive to Chinese influences. If he were to bring Chinese students to the US, first he would need to surmount a seismic wall ahead of him. What Liang does then is to embark on a 2-year campaign to talk to reporters across the US, engage senators in dialogue, to spread the word on the importance of Chinese students in the United States. His public rhetoric and private conversations eventually reach none other than then President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. In the early 20th century, Liang meets with Theodore Roosevelt, and there at their first conversation he finds a pleasant surprise. Roosevelt walks up to Liang and says, "You know, Minister, it's a pleasure to meet you. Were you on Andover's 1881 varsity baseball team?" It was then called the Academy Ball 9. Liang says yes, and then Roosevelt follows up with a thornier question. "Were you the best player on the Academy Ball 9? Liang's answer, I think, deserves to be the one thing that you remember from this presentation. He says, "Yeah." But a good story wouldn't suffice to, convince Roosevelt to bring Chinese students to the United States. Liang also had to make a convincing financial argument for it. And to that, he turns to the very events that brought him to the US in the first place, the Opium Wars of the 19th century. You see, after the US beat China in these wars, it demanded of China tremendous amounts of monetary reparations. It demanded that China send generous sums of money to repay the US for their supposed losses in the war. Not only did the US government demand money of China, it demanded way too much money of China. So in 1902, as Liang is engaging on his national campaign for diplomacy, he's also compiling documentation, proof of the fact that there was, in fact, too much money asked of China and that the US should give some of it back. Across dozens of conversations and months of correspondence, Roosevelt eventually agrees. In 1904, he writes to his Secretary of Commerce and Labor, George Cortelyou, saying, quote, "We wish to make ever firmer our intellectual hold upon China. It is for our interests that Chinese merchants should come here and that Chinese students should come here," end quote. For Roosevelt, bringing Chinese students to America would be a decidedly pragmatic act. It'd be a chance to influence the intellectual development of an entirely new generation of Chinese leaders. For Liang, it would be an opportunity to open Chinese students to the same educational opportunities that he himself benefited from as a student at Andover. It takes a few years, but eventually this rhetoric, this campaign, this dogged advocacy turns into triumph. In 1907, Liang successfully secures over $27 million for his country. That's over $830 million today. It's a generous sum of money. It came with years of hard work. What does Liang do with this money? He does two things. The first is to make sure that cohorts of Chinese students would travel to the US each year to receive a US education. The second is to establish a school called Tsinghua Academy in Peking. Tsinghua Academy would essentially be prep school for prep school. There, Chinese students would learn the rudiments of English and the skill sets necessary to help ensure that they would be able to conduct a smooth transition to their time in America. Today, Tsinghua Academy has become Tsinghua University, and it's the #1 research university in China today. The story comes full circle back to Andover. In 1913, Roosevelt, he's in the back seat right here, visits Andover at its 1913 commencement, not least of which to see the alma mater of his diplomatic colleague and partner, Liang. Liang's story is one of dogged diplomacy, sure. It's also one of tremendous advocacy. It's one that saw Liang use his opportunities in the United States, the English that he learned at Phillips Academy, to engage in a transnational conversation that would bring generations of Chinese students to America. It's a story of Liang, who received bigotry during his time at Andover on away games, into one of advocacy. That's the first story. Story number 2 begins in Rome in 1960. There's something more on the streets of Rome than lingering late summer heat in the air. There's the electricity of an Olympic Games. We're honing in on the Olympic Stadium, which seats over 65,000 people, at the finals of the 1,500 meters. This is the last event of the year's decathlon, one of the most anticipated events of the year's games. Our true frontrunners that gather on the starting line are Rafer Johnson and C.K. Yang, both from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. As Rafer and C.K. gather on the starting line, though, there's something more than just a gold medal hanging on the line. There's an entire history behind them. That history begins with Phillips Academy principal Alfred Stearns. Stearns, in 1903, becomes the principal of Andover. Perhaps some of you live in the dorm named after him today. In 1903, Stearns came to Andover as an Andover man through and through. He grew up around Andover in his youth. 2 of his great-grandfathers were founding members on Andover's first board of trustees. During Stearns' time at the academy, he is a standout athlete, much like Liang was. He excels at football, tennis, baseball. He graduates the most popular boy of his class in 1890. At Amherst College, he continues his athletic commitments. In fact, so excellent is he at the infield that upon his graduation, he receives offers to play in professional baseball. You'd think that this was all Stearns would have wanted at the time. He had devoted his entire life to athletics, after all. But Stearns rejects the offer. Instead, he opts to pursue a course of study at Andover Theological Seminary, a religious institution across the street from Phillips Academy that actually stood right where Kemper Auditorium stands today. At the Andover Theological Seminary, Stearns pursues a religious education in American Protestantism and also serves as Andover's first director of athletics. He continues his athletic commitments, but what this shift in Stearns' career tells us is that there was more than just athletics in Stearns' life. There was a profound commitment to spirituality. Now, Stearns isn't without problems, right? Dr. Kington has talked in findings from the Anti-Racism Task Force that under Stearns, enrollments of Black students all but disappeared. Stearns wasn't a perfect man, for sure. In the context of this story, he's a generous patron, and I want to just acknowledge both sides of that story. So how does a white man, who was the most popular boy in the preppiest boarding school in America, become interested in Chinese students? Well, we find a hint of an answer in a 1903 visit that Liang pays to Andover. The June 30th edition of the Philippian that year offers Liang a prominent spread on the front page and prints an entire transcript of Liang's address at the ceremonies, much like they did for the other speakers at the ceremony. This is more about Liang giving a speech and leaving campus, however. Stearns was careful to cultivate a close friendship with one of Andover's most distinguished alumni. Stearns leads Liang across campus, looking at new academic buildings, a gym that was just being constructed. Does that sound familiar to anyone? To a baseball game between alumni and the current varsity baseball team, where Liang is able to reminisce on the sidelines about his own time on the field. It wasn't just all about fun and games, however. Before Liang leaves, he's careful to, quote, discuss plans for the accommodation of several Chinese boys whom he had brought with him to America. Stearns was sure to listen to Liang. In fact, he paid such close attention to the Chinese ambassador on this visit, and he begins to take inspiration from it. This is just months into his tenure as principal, remember? He, across his tenure as principal, begins to become the closest of mentors for the Chinese students. During the school year, he would make sure that the students were financially taken care of, that their emotional well-being was accounted for, that their academic performance wasn't dropping. On school vacations, he would use his connections to set up programs for the students to attend across the US, even across North America, because travel back home was so hard and would take so much time. In the top left, you see Mary Sun. She was a student at Abbott who was at Abbott at the same time her three brothers were at Andover. All four children lived in Stearns' house for the entirety of their time on Andover Hill. If that tells you something about the closeness of the relationship, how many of your house counselors would allow you to live with them in their faculty apartment? I don't think that much. These are some of the postcards, too, that his students would send to him during their travels. Their mentorship and their relationship was one of tremendous intimacy. Knowing this, then, Stearns must have had tremendous influences on the intellectual development of Andover. Think to when you first arrived on campus and how much you've changed now. Now imagine you had a parent away from home that was as close a mentor as Stearns was. Stearns had a front row seat in not only the Chinese students' growth, but in influencing it. His value system that he chose to inculcate upon the Chinese students was muscular Christianity. This was an idea that began in the 19th century YMCA. You can see in the YMCA's 19th century logo that it held spirituality was more than just about an intellectual education. It was more than just books. It was also about the body. It was also about cultivating an athletic excellence that would be paramount to a good spiritual education. Stearns' own ties to the YMCA were also quite close. We find a hint of this in a 1925 postcard that his student Richard Thung sends to Stearns while he's on vacation. The postcard is sent from the Central YMCA in Montreal. Stearns likely used his connections to set up this arrangement for Thung on vacation. This was a clear mark of Stearns' connections to the institution that had started muscular Christianity and a train of thought that he himself found so appealing. We have to remember that Stearns is an athlete himself and just as committed to Christianity. His appointments as principal reflect that commitment to Christianity. Under Stearns, Andover sees its first ever chaplain. In 1907, Chaplain Stackpole is appointed to Andover. The theological seminary had just moved on to Harvard, and Stearns wanted to make sure that a religious education would remain central to the Andover way. Stackpole implements mandatory Bible study for lowers. Indeed, Andover was a decidedly religious institution at the time. What else goes into the Andover way? Well, there's a book called The Andover Way that tells us an answer. It was written by Claude Feast, another familiar name, who was then an English instructor at Andover. He would later succeed Stearns as headmaster upon Stearns' retirement in 1933. This cover says it all. The Andover Way is about a student busting his butt on the playing field. The Andover Way is decidedly athletic, Feast held in the 20th century. No student embodied that value system better than Zeng Xingquan, Guan Songsheng, who was a student who arrived at Andover in 1908. His father was a physician at the Imperial Medical College in Tianjin. In 1908, his father finds and is influenced and inspired by some of Liang's work as Chinese ambassador to the United States and chooses to send his own son to America. Quan arrives on Andover Hill in 1908, upon which his father sends Stearns the following note.
Dr. King Yin Kwan to Dr. Alfred Stearns, November 4, 1908. Having heard from my son, Sung Sing Kwan, that he is now under your kind care and guidance, may I have the honor to thank you for the kind protection which you have extended to him. It is really fortunate on my part to have such a Christian-like and liberal-minded person as you are to look after the Chinese boys whose future happiness and improvement of their country depend upon your good guidance. Words cannot liberate my feelings, and I hope you will accept my hearty thanks in these few lines.
Kwan goes on to spend his time at Andover as a standout student and a standout athlete. He would become one of the top runners in the Academy's track team. In 1910, he arrives at Andover and is placed in Day Hall. He goes through the school year and is excited to return to Andover in 1911, but that's when disaster strikes. China at this time was embroiled in political conflict. In 1911, a crumbling, corrupt Qing dynasty government finally succumbs to revolution, and Republican China is born. Kwan's father, as a physician at the Imperial Medical College, was closely tethered to the Qing dynasty government. The revolution brought seismic shifts to Kwan's life and his future. So in 1911, Kwan's father makes a decision to keep his son off of American soil that year. As Kwan packs his bags, he doesn't forget to send a note of gratitude to Stearns.
Sung Sing Kwan to Dr. Alfred Stearns, August 31st, 1911. My father has decided to keep me in China this year and to prepare to enter the Tsinghua College in Beijing, where I can pursue a future course of Chinese studies which I have been rather deficient. I shall, of course, lose no time on my other English subjects, and I hope that this will enable me to return to the States next summer, when I hope to have the pleasure of seeing you and Mrs. Stearns again.
I am quite confident that the advantages of an American education under your good guidance will benefit the Chinese at large, and the memory of your kind energy shall never be erased from those young hearts that derived their enlightenment from such a Christian-like principle as yourself.
Permit me to express to you again my gratitude for the kindness which you have bestowed on me, and I shall look back with mingled feelings upon the days I've spent under your care, and the circle of acquaintances I've made in Andover, whom I wish never to be forgotten, and to whom I hope to be always remembered.
It is needless for me to express my thanks in this letter for the kindness you have extended to my son, knowing that your devotion in educational work towards the Chinese boys is purely Christian-like spirit, and which is a mark of the good New Englanders of the eastern states of America. I sincerely hope that the result of your labor towards the Chinese will, in the near future, elevate China as a nation before the eyes of the world and for good works and good government.
Shout out and thanks to Sean and Dr. Legaspi for doing this. So, Kwan doesn't spend the rest of his life in China. In fact, a few years later, he finds himself back in America, continuing his athletic commitments. At MIT, he becomes captain of the MIT Chinese soccer team. And he doesn't forget about Andover. In fact, quite the opposite. When he had asked Stearns to remember him and for Andover to remember Kwan, he wasn't joking. MIT, the Chinese soccer team, actually plays Andover twice that year. Both times, MIT handily bests Kwan's alma mater. But this is more than just a story about a happy-go-lucky boy who likes sports and plays sports well. This is a story of intergenerational mentorship that is tethered to and cannot be separated from Liang's influence as ambassador and as a fellow Chinese student at Andover. Kwan was a student athlete who took muscular Christianity and found within it an opportunity to find his athleticism validated, his pursuit of athletics valid. He continues this commitment later into his life, and he also continues his correspondence with Stearns. In fact, the two men remain in close touch until Stearns' death in 1949. Why does this story matter? Why is it important that Andover found two generations of Chinese students from the late 19th century to the early 20th that would help each other? One, we can find an answer in just how influential Stearns was as a mentor for the Chinese students. We can see in the first wave that in the 19th century, Liang is a part of a first cohort of Chinese students that arrives at Andover. Between 1903 and 1933, Stearns' tenure, over 65 students pass under Stearns' watch on Andover Hill. We've already discussed how close and intimate and demanding these mentorships were for the principal. Stearns was one of the most ardent and fervent patrons of Chinese students at Andover. And Stearns was no lightweight beyond Andover Hill either. In 1925, he's pictured here with the presidents of Princeton, Yale, and Dartmouth. Stearns had the pulling power to bring the premier American educators in the country to the Samville Steps, where we walk every day. It's a familiar location with unfamiliar faces in an unfamiliar time, but we must know that Stearns was engaged in an advocacy of his own. He might not have called it advocacy, but he was certainly pushing back against a dominant American public opinion that wanted nothing to do with the Chinese students. Here he is pictured on the 1926 cover of Time. Stearns, as historian Frederick Jordan has written, was a, quote, public intellectual whose opinions were sought after far beyond Andover Hill. Stearns essentially stood out and said, no, I want to be a supporter of the Chinese students at a time when the Chinese Exclusion Act was at its height. Stearns was no perfect man. Many of his activities as principal were problematic, but this was an area in which he was decidedly inclusive. In 1913 then, when Roosevelt visits Andover for the 1913 commencement, he's not just visiting Liang, he's visiting Stearns. He's visiting a school that has done so much for Chinese students in America, its alumni having facilitated that connection, and its principal having continued it. Now I know what you're all thinking. What about that decathlon, right? The decathlon takes us to 1954. Quan, at this point, is one of the best architects that China has ever seen, and one of its most generous athletic patrons. In 1958, Quan watches the Asian Games and spots a young lad in the crowd that he thinks is worth cultivating. This man is C.K. Yang, who's from Japanese-occupied Taiwan, from the indigenous Ami tribe. Yang, at the 1958 Games, takes gold in the decathlon, and Quan immediately sets its sights on this young man. After the race, Quan walks up to Yang and offers to fully finance Yang's education at UCLA and to study and train under legendary track coach Elvin Ducky Drake. During Yang's time at UCLA, Quan acts as a figure much like Stearns was to Quan decades earlier. Quan was attentive to Yang's every need, making sure that he had every little thing that he wanted or could imagine. Quan's own children would later reflect, if we wanted anything from our father, we dared not ask. But if Yang wanted anything from our father, it was already bought for him. Yang passes his time at UCLA with a father figure not unlike that which Quan received in Stearns. He quickly becomes friends with one of the UCLA's premier athletes, Rayford Johnson, who's a standout football player as well as an excellent track athlete. The two men go into the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome as the two top dogs in the decathlon. Day one of competition opens with the two men neck and neck. CK actually wins 4 of 5 events on day one, but Rayford has an excellent performance in the shot put, which puts him slightly ahead heading into day 2 of competitions. On day 2, the two men trade leads back and forth with dramatic swings on either side. Yang then heads into the 1,500 meters just slightly behind Rayford, but not all hope is lost. You see, Yang is by far the faster miler. As he's standing on that starting line, he knows that Quan has put so much into his time at UCLA. He knows that he's a part of a legacy of Chinese athletics that was its first debut on the Olympic stage, on the Olympics finals stage. So as the two men line up on the starting line, CK knows this. If he can outrun Rafer by over 10 seconds in the finals, then the gold would be his. This was entirely feasible for CK at the time. In fact, his personal best was almost 19 seconds faster than Johnson heading into the 1960 Rome 1500 finals. So shotgun is fired and the two men are off to the races. The two men begin neck and neck, and at lap 3, CK looks over his shoulder expecting to see Rafer at least a good, decent amount behind him. But when he turns around, he sees Johnson right on his heel. Johnson continues to stick right to CK throughout the entire race, and as the two men round the backstretch, CK knows that the end is near. The two men cross the finish line just 2 seconds apart, and Johnson takes the gold in the 1960 Rome decathlon. This isn't just a story about disappointment, however. It's a story of triumph. In medaling in the 1960 Olympic decathlon, Yang became the first athlete of Chinese descent ever to medal at an Olympic Games. Not only that, but he quickly became a national hero. Taiwan's government paid close attention to Yang for the remainder of his athletic career, much like it did to Quan. In fact, Quan was the founding member of the Taiwan Track and Field Association and was hailed as the father of Taiwan's track and field and one of the most revered public intellectuals and patrons of his time. The friendship between Johnson and Yang, too, is noteworthy because it tells us how wide the web of Chinese alumni influences is. Chinese students graduated from Andover to mentor subsequent generations of Chinese students from Andover who went on to become friends, colleagues, mentors, fathers, brothers, to so many across the United States. The true scope of these relationships, of this web of alumni solidarity, is hard to fathom. I've just traced one thread for us here today. Asked why he chose to devote so much to his athletes, Quan said the following, quote, "One does not promote good athletes for themselves. It's like gardening, that the true fun happens when everybody appreciates the blossoming flower," end quote. For Quan, he saw a blossoming flower in Yang, just as Stern saw a blossoming flower in him decades ago. Quan saw in Yang an opportunity for a young lad to make his mark on this world, to go forth with high hopes, dream big, and actually achieve those dreams. So is this story one of two-star baseball pitchers across 2 generations? Yes, but it's also much more than that. It's about how Andover's Chinese students faced adversity with agency, faced acrimony with affection. The Chinese Exclusion Act should have made none of these stories possible. And yet, here I am today, standing on this stage, telling you about them. Andover was a problematic institution at the turn of the 20th century, but we cannot deny that it was also one of the most formative for Chinese students in America. So in a story about multi-generational mentorship, I thought I'd end with my own. It was Mother's Day this past Sunday, so I thought I'd embarrass my mother in front of a crowd of, 100 to 200. My mother was born in a rural village in southeast China. My grandmother, her mother, was a public educator at the local village school. No insurance, no benefits, quite literally risking her life each day to serve the most under-resourced and disadvantaged of communities. On rainy days, my grandmother would carry my mother on her back across the long, winding, and now muddied village paths to the village school. There, my mother would sit in the back of the classroom as my grandmother's students worked on exercise books. My mother would later become a chemistry prodigy, win second prize at the national chemistry exams, attend Peking University for chemistry in 1995. In 1999, she wins a full-ride scholarship to attend the University of Minnesota studying chemistry, There, she finds a chemistry of her own in my dad. I'm sure my parents would be thrilled when they watch this recording. And in 2004, I was born. Thank you so much. In 1980, my mother found herself on my grandmother's back as she walked the long and winding village paths to the village school. 4 decades later, in 2020, I would find myself walking up Main Street to Bullfinch for English class. My mother was walking to a village school known only by its proximity to neighboring cities. I was walking on the most prestigious high school campus in America. On many rainy days, I would walk that long walk from Abbott to Bullfinch for English 200 with Mr. Nehemiah. There, one winter evening, I watched Dead Poets Society for the first time. It sounds like all of you know it, but this was a 1989 film that talked about the importance of an unfettered, authentic humanities education. The Chinese translation for Dead Poets Society is 春风化雨, a spring draft that summons rain. It's a metaphor for the most nurturing and generative of mentorships. Just as spring rain can help a seed blossom and grow, a faculty member and influential mentor can see the blossom in one of their students and help their students grow as well. 春风化雨 then tells the story of intergenerational mentorship, as does the story of Chinese students in America. So I thought I'd end then with an embodied exercise to pay homage to this spring rain. Just follow my lead here, and you'll have to bear with me as we go along in this. So let's divide the room into 3 sections, okay? Over here we have the right wing. Here's the, not politics. We have the right wing, the middle wing, and the left wing, okay? So, as I move across the room, just follow my lead, and when I look at you or look at your section, begin doing as I am doing, okay? So let's do a practice round. All right. Right wing, and I hesitate to say that. Okay, just follow my lead. Middle wing, follow suit. Now left wing. All right. Keep everything going, keep it going. Now, let's begin snapping. Center wing. Left wing. Just keep on going. Guys, if you can quiet down our voices so we can try to hear what this is doing. Now right wing. Now right wing. Thank you. Thank you for that. Just a quick note before we enter Q&A. I actually wanted to conclude with a note to this audience. Kwan had said, quote, "The true fun happens when everybody appreciates the blossoming flower." So many of us are at Andover living the day-to-day, and it's easy to lose sight of just what a campus we're on. Around us are faculty members, adults, students, peers, friends. There's bound to be someone on this campus that sees a blossoming flower in you. Whether you have a few months or a few years left at Andover, remember that we're a part of a history, a legacy of Chinese students at Andover that has helped each other thrive across generations. They lived in times decidedly different from ours, and we live in times decidedly different from the ones that our children and grandchildren will live. But across time, there's one durable thing. Someone will always want to see you in bloom. Thank you. So much. And just a quick note of thanks too to my spring rain, and then we can go directly into Q&A. No need for the applause. Y'all are much too generous. Thank you so much. I'm Martin, the coordinator of the CAMD Scholars Program, has been so formative to my entire journey as a CAMD scholar, but also as a student at Andover. I first met her in this very auditorium. At the 2020 Andover Writers Symposium, I helped her break down cardboard boxes that day. And today, I'm standing at this podium where so many wonderful people have stood. It's crazy. I mean, now I get to say that I've stood at the same podium as Ibram X. Kendi and John Palfrey. Like, isn't that crazy? Thanks long overdue to Mr. Curtis, to the Polk staff who have been instrumental in helping me both calm my nerves and get this presentation together. Of course, to Dr. Roberts and Dr. Xiao Li, my advisors, informal and formal on this project. Could not have done any of it without you. To every single student, faculty, staff, alumnus in the audience, I know you all so well, and if I don't, I really want to get to know you well.
Love you, Craig!
Thank you. To my fellow CAMD scholars, Emiliano, Jane, Anushka, Ariana, Melanie, this was really the most supportive of cohorts I could have asked for. The scholars iMessage group chat will always live on. And to the next cohort of scholars, you're in for a treat. All right, pick me apart. Any questions, ideas, thoughts, anger? I think, and Martin will help run the mic. Let's see.
Okay, hi, I'm Ethan. It was a really great presentation, Frank. Really loved it.
Thank you so much.
I was wondering, kind of like, I feel like when you were talking about like the conversations between like Tang and Roosevelt, you kind of identified these like two separate agendas of like Yang wanted to obviously like bring like a Western education to like China and like Chinese students following the events of like the Opium Wars and like the Center of Humiliation, whereas Roosevelt was like big on like we get to control the development of like an entire generation of like one of the most powerful, like a very like potentially powerful country. I was wondering like if you saw anything while you were researching of like either of those two agendas coming to fruition. Like, did you see that like China learned a lot from the West and like Western education through these exchange students, And like, did you see that like American ideals were able to like seep into the East through these exchanges as well?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. Thank you, Ethan. He's just outlined the premise of the continuation of this Kennedy Scholars paper, if anyone wants to write it, exploring that legacy. The answer is yes, and I'm no expert. So US educational institutions weren't all like Andover at the turn of the 20th century. In fact, a lot of the students who came to the US as a result of some of Liang's work didn't go to private schools like Andover. So the diversity within these Chinese students and their experiences as Chinese students in the US cannot be understated. It's hard-pressed for me to say that all of them learned one thing, or that all of them were able to bring Western education influences back to China. But studies of the Chinese students in America tend to hinge around big names or people who ended up accomplishing something later in life. So that, again, is already selection bias. But you see leaders in Kwan's case, architecture, but in diplomacy, in academia, emerge from these educational institutions as Chinese students in America. And a quick search on JSTOR will give you a paper whose abstract lists maybe close to 24 names for you to look into. So the short answer is yes, in terms of Chinese students being able to bring Western education, their experiences as social capital, if nothing else, back to China. There have been novels written about this. Fortress Besieged is one prime example. But a lot of the Chinese students in America's stories have been forgotten by nature of them. If they didn't accomplish something later in life, if there was no noteworthy thing that historians have deemed story-worthy, then their stories aren't documented. So there's certainly silences and gaps there. To your point about the US being able to increase their sort of stranglehold on China, the way that Roosevelt put it, I would say that US influences and Western influences on China in the 20th century are about as pervasive as anything gets. In literature, in film, in artistry, in diplomacy, even in economics. There's an entire history in the reforming and opening up period, 改革开放时期, where China essentially takes on this attitude of let's learn what we can and discard what we don't want. But there's something to see in these nations that we've previously disregarded. And so it was a larger national attitude that the Chinese students certainly were exposed to as students in America. But this is something where it's hard to figure out where the influences can be teased out and attributed single-handedly to one cause or another, because Chinese history is sort of chock full of US influences during this time. Hopefully that answers part of your question.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Frank.
Hi.
I just wanted to say, thank you so much for this presentation. I was amazed by everything. I was especially overwhelmed by the impactfulness and the deep meaning behind the Chinese presence here at Andover, which is why my question is, and I'm hoping that this speaks for a lot of people, just that I'm wondering how we can sort of connect to such an impressive legacy that we have behind our existences today at Andover.
Well, the first is you're already doing it. Stearns was President Philo when he was here. Sorry to put you on the spot. But in terms of tangible connections to the legacy, I'm going to quote from people who are much smarter than me. Clint Smith spoke at All School Meeting today. He had said that there is no single person who is singly good or singly bad. In a conversation when he sat down with a small cohort of students afterwards in the Freeman Room. I'm a firm believer in that. It's important to connect ourselves to their legacy, looking into the archives and special collections, checking out some of these documents on stage to see if any pique your interest. All of those are ways to get involved. Dr. Roberts could certainly use more student researchers in the archives and special collections. There's so much to be done on this front. The second is my presentation sort of tells their story in a way that is digestible in a 45 to 50 minute chunk. Don't idolize these students as singly good or singly bad. Their legacy is just as complicated as it is impressive. So learn up, read up, engage in the resources we have on campus, maybe do a Philo history day that details, the influences of Philo, which is incredible. It's all over the place in the Philippian, back issues of the Philippian, which are all digitized and online, 1 or 2 clicks away. There's a lot to do in terms of self-education. Awareness is the first step, and that can open up so many more doors.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Frank. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was I think this was a really engaging presentation, and just both in the way you spoke, oh my God, you went through your entire thing, and I did not even check my phone for the time. I was like, wow, you went through 2 stories. I was so impressed. But I think the most engaging part was the end. Would you be able to elaborate on what your intention was for the audience, I guess, and both what your intention was, but also I would assume there could be multiple ways to take it, so other takes you could have?
Of course, yes. So I don't know if people got the gist of that activity because we were running a little bit short on time. That was supposed to be the practice, and you're supposed to do it all over again with no one talking. But it was supposed to be sort of simulating rain, right? Simulating a rainstorm. The reason was because we had just ended with the image of spring rain, of the importance of rain in cultivating mentorship and being generative and nourishing for students. The spring rain was supposed to be the penultimate chapter of the presentation. I was supposed to add a blurb at the end that connected the activity to the rest of the presentation and the importance of its legacy. But the spirit of it was that, us as as students at Andover right now, we are, we have our own support systems, whether that's with faculty or with mentors, with peers, with students. They are our spring rain. They are, the nourishment and the sort of dew that keeps us going. So I wanted to be an homage to that and to a gratitude note, essentially, a collective gratitude note to those influences and that support.
Okay, while I'm walking over, I'm going to just add one other interpretation that I got from it, because while I'm back here backstage listening, it really did sound like some spring rainstorm. And for me, it's this, everybody's doing one small action, but collectively we made this incredible magic together. And one small action, one small rub doesn't do anything, but all of us doing our little part, we created this incredible synergy, right? We created something that not one of us could do on our own. And that to me is what real mentorship is, right? We are mentoring each other, and we're creating something beautiful together. And it was incredible to hear. I don't know if you could hear it, but I could hear it from backstage, and it was mind-blowing. Yeah.
Thank you. Now you know why she's CAMD Scholar Coordinator. She can say everything much better than I could. So.
Okay. So first of all, great presentation. That was amazing. And so, towards the end of the presentation, you had the graph of the admissions rates of Chinese students.
This is graduation rates, actually.
Oh, graduation rates.
Yes.
Okay. But there's a large pitfall between Stearns and the eventual resurgence in the 1980s and 90s. Can you speak about what happened to the graduation rates from that time?
Of course, yeah. So a few things to note about this graph. One is the sort of huge spike in students from 1970s onwards, particularly around the 1980s, things really take off. I'll address that. The dip is in large part due to the larger trajectory of Chinese history. You see in 1930 that things sort of drop off, right? And it's not that no students were here. This is actually one on the graph if you trace it over. But at this time, China is embroiled in civil war between Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and Gongchandang, the Communist Party. So civil war begins to embroil the Chinese mainland. It continues into the 1949 Communist Revolution. And upon the sort of rise of the Chinese Communist Party, 1949, there's a sort of isolationist policy that begins to take shape under Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. This comes to a height in the 1960s, from 66 to 76, during the Cultural Revolution, 文化大革命, the Cultural Revolution. And so much of Chinese history from that time is about political persecution being the name of the game, any influences that would declare you as anti-communist, including any foreign influences, would have been scorned, could have gotten you in jail, publicly hazed and humiliated, sometimes even killed. A film that I would recommend if you really want to look into this history is 霸王别姬. I think it's Farewell My Concubine in English, which explores the history of the Cultural Revolution. Foreign influences was a no-go. So these students who continued to come to Andover often came from Hong Kong and Taiwan and other places that were not as privy to the influences of the Chinese mainland. The spike in the 1980s is due to another educational exchange program that was actually the subject of an independent scholar project that I did in winter term. There was a program that was started by Bartle Tirana, who was an Andover alumnus working in the DC defense milieu, and Josh Miner, who was the director of admissions here in the 1980s, to say, Nixon has visited China in 1972. We sense that Chinese relations seem to be opening up a little bit post-Cultural Revolution. Let's try to see if there's anything that we can do about bringing Chinese students to America. So Tirana uses his connections. It's with a corporate mogul over in northeastern China. And they settle on the Harbin Institute of Technology, a northeastern institute that is called Hagongda in Chinese, that was one of a handful of institutions that was declared by the Chinese government as important institutions to watch out for, in helping China rebuild itself. It was called the Reform and Opening Up period, so in helping China reform itself. The HIT program then, beginning in 1980 or so, starts sending 3 Chinese students to Andover a year. And on top of that, Chinese students from Hong Kong and Taiwan continue streaming in. So the HIT and Andover exchange program was actually the first high school educational exchange program between the People's Republic of China and the US. It was a program that continued into the early 2000s, but was ultimately discontinued. Essentially, it began to phase out after the early 2000s because students used to be able to come to the US for an entire year, and then Andover would be in charge of helping them apply to college, and then they would go to college in the US. Later, it became Andover would no longer be in charge of their college education, so some students would have to go back to the mainland. Some chose to abscond and stay in the US. And later, it became just a summer program. So Andover students would go to Shanghai Datong Zhongxue, Shanghai Datong Middle School, and a host of other institutions over the summer, and HIT students would come to the US. So it began its sort of incremental phase out in the early 2000s. The drop off here is because we didn't collect data on it here. So yes, that's the story behind this peak and this dip. Thank you.
I also wanted to say that was a really amazing presentation.
Thank you.
I agreed with Alina, and also I really love the design of your slides. I kept taking pictures of every slide. So my question is, you focus a lot on how the US worked with Liangchen and getting Chinese students to the US. Mm-hmm. How did officials and people in China react to that, especially given how a lot of students were mentored by outsiders like white people like Stearns and stuff? How did Chinese people react to that?
Yeah. I can again talk about this in terms of generations. The reason Liang left Andover in 1881 wasn't because he actually graduated, it was because he was a non-returning middler, I believe. So the Chinese education mission, the program by which the Qing dynasty would send cohorts of Chinese students to the US, ended in 1881 very abruptly. The story has it that there were Chinese students in America who wanted to cut off their queues, cut off the long braids behind their head. You see Liang had cut off his. And when news of that reached Chinese diplomats, they started realizing the, quote, Americanization, end quote, of these Chinese students was going way too far. We only want them to be in the US to learn American ways so that they can bring it back to China, not so that they can stay in America. So that's why they recall the 1881 program. And that's the Chinese diplomatic reaction to the early phases of Chinese educational exchange. The second phase is more nebulous in terms of why and how Chinese diplomats received it. The parents of students here were tremendously effusive. Dr. Legaspi gave us a taste of that with his readings. The reception of other parents, other students, I wasn't able to look into. My guess would be that it would be a mixed bag, because certainly it could be used as as a political handle to say, my goodness, why are you doing this? This is unjust. You are absorbing foreign influences at a time when China is coming out of a history of foreign humiliation. So that's another part of what public reception likely was. I would point you towards JSTOR Searchers of Political Rhetoric in China in the 1920s and 30s onwards for a potential deep dive.
Thank you.
Yep. Hi, Jane.
Frank, you're our spring rain, and we always love to see you bloom.
Thank you.
I loved your presentation, and I couldn't help but wonder, you mentioned the importance of recognizing the complexities, and also, as impressive as these figures are, they also have quite complicated histories and legacies. Would you mind elaborating on some of the complexities you found in your research?
Yes. So, I have a mic, right? Some of the complexities. Stearns himself wasn't just someone who discouraged black students to come to the US. In fact, if you took a look at black student enrollments, you would probably see this as pre-Stearns, this is during Stearns. It all but extinguished during Stearns' time at Andover. That's a part of the complexity. Now, Stearns wrote glowing recommendation letters for several black students that he was close friends with, but his rhetoric there was similarly iffy. He would say good for a black student, right? Good relative to other black students. And so that's certainly problematic rhetoric as well. For more on that, I would point you towards the Archives and Special Collections, which has all the letters that Dr. Kington is referencing when he's talking about institutional history, and that certainly could use more student help in terms of deep dives and research. Complicated legacies for Liang and Quan are a little bit harder, because to the extent that research has been conducted and attention has been paid to their stories, it's been in the sort of positive cultivation of Taiwan track and field, for example, or of Chinese educational exchange. Liang, if nothing else, knew about the sort of follies of Andover. He himself experienced it as a student, but did continue to send Chinese students to Andover. On the one hand, we can read that as an important dedication to, cultivating these students, the youth of China's tomorrow. On the other hand, you could read that as placing students in an environment where Liang would know that there was the potential for harm, right? And that Liang would know racism and bigotry would be a facet of the Chinese students' lives. The Chinese students, too, found their transition to US to be incredibly difficult. I mentioned Mary's correspondences with Principal Stearns. Mary had a tough time in the States adjusting to a lot of the social dynamics and academic rigors of Abbott and of the institutions she attended following. She would write these notes to Stearns, worrying about, oh my God, what am I supposed to do about prom? That's probably familiar, right? But Liang he wasn't the person who brought Chinese students to Andover in particular. He would facilitate some connections on a case-by-case basis, but he facilitated those connections knowing that this wouldn't be a perfect experience for them, and that it had the potential to sort of go awry in the same ways that his did.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We have time for...
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so informative and amazing. I was just wondering, and wanted your thoughts on just how there can be more mentorship. I'm wondering too when it comes to affirmative action and when students are being brought to schools or to forms of schooling to have that specific education, and how it too may be up to like the institution to be that mentor and be like that extra push. And so I'm wondering like how you see like these forms of mentorship in the future, or if I don't know if they were only useful in the past for these like.
Sure. Yeah. Now, I'm not sitting in any position where I could directly make these changes, so I'll make the recommendations knowing that I'm an outsider. So take my words with a grain of salt. Miss Boyd was sitting in the back corner of Kemper earlier today. She's the director of ACE, which is a wonderful, wonderful program that's helped students transition to Andover. We have some ACE kids in the audience with us. That is a model that I find very compelling and very fruitful. I know that if there were to be a similar program implemented for, say, Chinese students or students of East Asian descent, there would have to be a number of different and additional mechanisms and different emphases, right? For a lot of people, the language transition is really, really difficult. For others, the understanding and coming to terms with social dynamics, extracurricular dynamics, really, really hard. I, for better or for worse, have some Chinese parents who will ask me to go on crisis calls with their kids to talk about just what is going on with their time at Andover, at elsewhere. I've talked to kids who go to school in Florida, want to go to school in Wisconsin. Across boarding schools, regardless of where they stand on niche's rankings, students do need additional support when they're coming into the academy. So a program with a dedicated faculty member, perhaps with more funding, if that's possible, committed to being attentive to those sort of mentorship mechanisms would be really important. Now, I don't want that to become a sort of Teach for America-esque mentorship program where you're just plopping in high-achieving students into the situation and saying, figure it out. But to say that we can have students with a language background, with a cultural understanding, with the sort of nonviolent communication training to be able to enter into these spaces and do good for students coming to American educational institutions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we leave time? Maybe one more, and then you guys gotta come and see the stuff on the tables over here, right?
Hi, Frank. I had a joke prepared, but I'm not sure if we have time for that.
Go for it.
All right. Well, I was very excited about the end of the speech with the spring rain because I thought you were going to break into a polyrhythm, but unfortunately not. But we can catch up on that later tonight in the dorm.
Yep.
My question is, what is, I guess, the definition of China in this study and perhaps also personally for you?
You've just asked a central question of so many area studies experts. I don't pretend to be one of them. I can aspire. I am not currently. The definition of China in this study was somewhat nebulous, especially because you have very itinerant students. Quan began in Tianjin, but in 1911, from 1911 to 1913, roughly, he's staying in Hong Kong because to sort of stay out of harm's way during the revolution. So I can treat geographically China as students who come from the Chinese mainland, who, in Quan later in life would move to Taiwan and stay there for the rest of his life. So in terms of geography, it would include Taiwan and Hong Kong, not because of geopolitical considerations, but because of immigration and home-going considerations for the Chinese students. Also important to my study, and in the subsequent work on the HIT students later, was what is the sort of value system that they're coming from, the social consciousness that they're using to orient themselves in America. So Liang, for example, spent a couple years in America before coming to Andover. He's still a Chinese student. At that point, you could treat a generous definition of Chinese American might include him under Chinese American with the sort of sensibilities that he's beginning to adapt, the value systems, mannerisms, and sort of understandings that he is beginning to cultivate. But China, in this case, is a geographical area, a shared country of origin, often, but not always, with linguistic overlap, right? So Cantonese is certainly the history of Cantonese and Mandarin is very problematic, as you probably know. But so China, in this case, I didn't use a linguistic definition. It was more of a consideration of where are these students who begin in a geographical area that's considered China, where do they go, where is the sort of reach of their diaspora? And that, I guess, is the sort of more abstract, figurative definition of China that I took in this study.
Perhaps just to narrow the question a bit, what was the definition you used for the graph you showed?
I did not make this graph. Oh, the graph is not on screen. The graph was made by Xiao Li, who's a digital humanist at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I would point, Dr. Roberts, perhaps, do you know what Dr. Li used in making the metrics for this graph? Because Stearns, interestingly, spoke about having mentored much more than only 65. He would say hundreds in his letters. So that's an important disparity, discrepancy.
There were kids who he was legal guardian for who did not come to Andover, who were at other schools, because most of those kids went to universities, right? During Stearns' tenure.
Okay, so just to amplify that for people, a lot of the students that Stearns mentored during his time at Andover weren't strict Andover students and went on to other educational institutions following. So when Stearns says mentoring hundreds, there's some of them come from Andover, others don't. In terms of direct measurements for measuring China in this graph, I can follow up with you after consulting with Dr. Li. Thank you for the good question.
Thank you.
All right, come up. I don't bite. These documents certainly don't bite. Feel free to take a look as you wish.
You're amazing. So inspiring, seriously. Great
Hopefully
job.
it was engaging enough for you.
Very, very engaging. Yeah, you have my phone.
Thank you so much.
I teared up.
No.
I'm so fucking proud of you.
Thank you so much.
You are the definition of greatness. I'm fucking so fucking honored to learn from you.
I still never get a lower year in America House. The days.
Great job, man. Thank you so much. Yeah, amazing.
You were definitely ready.
Oh.
Amazing job.
Thank you,
I loved it.
Thank you so much.
He's right back there. He's right back there.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming today.
Of course. I mean, wow, I was just so amazed.
doing it, boys?
You have a real gift for storytelling. And
it took a while to prepare this.
I hope you get the opportunity to do, more of this.
We could take over this microphone,
Something
low-key.
unusual, I think.
I'll have Frank do it, though.
Yeah, we'll chat soon, too.
But still.
Happy to chat more about this.
Learned so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yep. Have a good night. Thank you so much for coming out here.
Frank,
Yep.
I'm so happy for you. Give me a hug.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Thank you, Austin. Yeah, of course.
Such a good
Of course.
I literally felt like I was at, when they say there's those TED Talks that go down in history forever and everyone watches them and people become celebrities? That's you.
well,
I recognize
all the pictures from the retreat. You showed me the pictures.
Oh, I did?
Yeah, of your parents.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I've dished out my life secrets to Haley already. But.